She was 53 years old. The autumn, everything she owned fit inside a single flour sack in the pockets of a coat that no longer kept out the wind. And the man who put her there was her own brother-in-law, Elias Crandall, who read her late husband's debts aloud at the county courthouse in Harrow's Bend, Colorado, and smiled the whole while because a widow with no sons and no signature on the deed was in his ledger of the world. Nothing at all. She left the auction with $84 folded against her ribs and no place to lay her head. And then 3 days later, against every counsel of every sensible soul in that dry valley, she paid $840, borrowed, scraped, and promised for a dying walnut orchard on the ruined north slope, 40 acres of gray, leafless trees that the town called cursed and the bank called worthless. Folks laughed until they wept. But down beneath those brittle roots, sealed in stone and silence, waited something that would not only save her, but bring an entire withered town back to life. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Vasey. If you are watching tonight from a place that feels forgotten, a town the railroad passed by, a house the years have emptied, tell us in the comments where you are, so we may hold your name in mind as we tell this one. We should begin where she began, because a life like an orchard is read best from the root. Marguerite was born, Marguerite Aldous, in the year 1849 in a low stone farmhouse along the Cache la Poudre, the fourth of 6 children and the only one who could not be kept indoors. Her father, Thomas Aldous, was a man who understood water the way a preacher understands scripture, not as a thing to be owned, but as a thing to be listened to. He had come west with a divining rod cut from witch hazel and a stubbornness that the plains never managed to sand down, and he taught all his children to read the land. But only Marguerite truly learned the language. She could walk a dry draw in August and tell you, by the slant of the cottonwoods and the color of the soil and the particular hush of the insects, where the ground still remembered being wet. Her father called it a gift. Her mother, Ada, a practical woman with flour always to her elbows, called it a nuisance that would keep the girl unmarried, and was wrong on both counts. What the child learned in those years was not merely where water hid, but a deeper and less nameable thing. That value did not announce itself. The richest ground was often the ugliest, choked with thistle, passed over by every neighbor with an eye only for the green and easy fields. Her father would kneel and take up a handful of that despised dirt and let it run through his fingers and say quietly, so only she could hear, that the Lord buried his best gifts where lazy men would not stoop to look. She carried that sentence in her for the rest of her days like a seed sown into a hem. She married late, at 29, a soft-spoken orchardman named Peter Vasey, who had a face like weathered pine and hands that knew grafting better than any in the territory. They settled south of Harrow's Bend on good bottomland, and for 22 years they were, by the only measure that mattered to them, wealthy, not in coin, of which they kept little, but in the particular contentment of 2 people whose work agreed with the world. Peter taught her the trees, she taught him the water, and between them they coaxed apples and plums and a small stand of walnuts from ground the previous owner had given up as spent. They had no children who lived past their first winters, and this was a grief they folded away and rarely opened, but it made them tender toward each other and toward every struggling thing that grew. Marguerite kept the accounts in a neat hand, doctored the neighbors' sick horses, set broken fingers, and read water for anyone who asked, and she never once took payment for the last, because a gift sold, her father had told her, stops being a gift. By the time she was 50, the people of Harrow's Bend knew her as the woman to see when the well ran dry, and they came, hats in hand, and she went, rod in hand, and more often than not, the water came too. She did not think of herself as remarkable. She thought of herself as her father's daughter, which to her was the finest thing a person could be. She had a small library of 11 books, a good mule named Hosea, a set of grafting knives kept oiled and keen, and a husband asleep beside her every night, and she believed, in the untroubled way of the fortunate, that the shape of her days had settled for good. She did not yet know how much a person can lose in a single season, nor how strangely that loss can plant the very thing that redeems it. The fall came the way most falls come, not as a single blow, but as a slow subtraction, so that she scarcely believed it, even as it was happening. Peter took a fever in the wet March of 1901, a chill that settled into his chest and would not be coaxed out, and though Marguerite sat with him through 19 nights and tried every remedy her hands knew, He slipped from her on a gray morning, while the first blossoms were opening on the very trees he had grafted, which struck her then and ever after as the cruelest of the year's small mercies. She buried him under the largest apple, as he had asked, and for a time the grief was so total that she did not notice the other thing gathering at the edges of her life, the thing that wore a man's face in a banker's suit. That man was Elias Crandall, her husband's half-brother, a person Peter had spoken of rarely and never warmly. Elias had gone into money the way other men go into the ministry, with a convert's certainty that everything and everyone had a price, and over the years he had bought up notes and mortgages across the valley until he sat like a spider at the center of Harrow's Bend's debts. What Marguerite had not known, what Peter, out of shame or hope, had never told her, was that in the two hard drought years of 1898 and 1899, when their crops had failed and the taxes had come due all the same, Peter had borrowed against the farm, and he had borrowed it from his own brother. And the paper that bound their bottomland had passed quietly into Elias Crandall's black portfolio. Elias came to her not 2 months after the funeral, when the ground over Peter was still settling, and he came with the paper and a witness and that thin smile that never reached his eyes. He was sorry for her loss, he said, in the tone a man uses to be sorry for weather. But debts were debts, and the law was the law, and a widow's grief, regrettably, paid no interest. He gave her the numbers, and the numbers were more than the farm was worth, more than she could raise in 10 years of good harvests. And he gave her, too, the gift of his condescension, the offer to let her stay on as a tenant, working her own husband's trees for a wage that would keep her just above starving and just below dignity. She looked at him a long moment across the kitchen table where she had fed him a Christmas dinner only 2 years before, and she declined. The auction was held in October on the courthouse steps in Harrow's Bend, and half the town came, not to bid, for none of them had the money and none of them wished to bid against a widow, but to stand witness, which is the only justice the poor can sometimes offer. Marguerite stood among them in her good black dress and watched her home sold in the time it takes to boil coffee. Elias bought it himself, of course, at a fraction of its worth, folding the deed into his coat as calmly as a man pocketing a receipt. The mule Hosea went to a neighbor. The 11 books went into a crate she could not afford to store. When it was done, she had her clothes, her father's divining rod, her grafting knives, and $84, which was what remained of the household money after the lawyer took his share, and she stood on the courthouse steps as the crowd thinned around her and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that she was at 53, beginning again from less than nothing. She spent 2 nights in the back room of the boarding house run by a kind woman named Ottilie Fisk, who charged her nothing and pretended the room was always empty anyway. And it was there, on the second sleepless night, listening to the windwork at the loose shingles, that Marguerite thought of the North Slope. Everyone in Harrow's Bend knew the North Slope, and no one wanted it. It was a 40-acre parcel of walnut trees planted, so the story went, some 40 years before, by a Frenchman named Bertrand Osier, who had arrived with grand plans in a strange, secretive manner, dug and built and labored for 3 summers, and then vanished one winter without a word, leaving behind an orchard that no one could make thrive. The trees grew, but slowly, solemnly. They threw few nuts, and those bitter. The ground beneath them was cracked and pale and would not hold a garden. Twice the parcel had been bought by hopeful newcomers, and twice abandoned. The town had come to call it Osier's Folly, and darker souls called it cursed, and it had sat unsold on the county's books for 11 years, the price dropping each year like a fever breaking, until it stood at $840, which was a joke, because there was not a soul in the valley fool enough to pay 840 cents for it. But Marguerite Vasey had walked that slope once, years before, on an errand she had half forgotten, and something about it had lodged in her like a splinter. She had knelt, out of old habit, and taken up a handful of that despised pale dirt, and she had felt she could describe it no better then or later a coolness, a faint, impossible breath of damp rising from ground that every eye declared bone dry. She had said nothing at the time. Peter was alive then, and the thought had seemed idle. But now, ruined and sleepless, her father's voice came to her across the years, telling her that the Lord buries his best gifts where lazy men will not stoop to look, and she rose in the dark and made her decision before she could talk herself out of it. She could not buy it with $84. And so she did the only thing left to a woman with nothing but her reputation. She went the next morning to every person in Harrow's Bend whose well she had ever found, whose horse she had ever doctored, whose broken hand she had ever set. And she asked them plainly to lend her what they could against a promise in her name. It was a humbling business, and she did not pretend otherwise. But water she had given them freely for 20 years, and the valley, whatever its poverty, was not without memory. Audley Fisk gave $40 from a sugar tin. The blacksmith, Amos Reyes, gave 60 and asked no interest. A dozen families gave 5 and 10 and once. From a widower with less than she had, a single silver dollar pressed into her palm with both his hands. When she counted it all on Audley's kitchen table, she had $841, and she wept for the first time since the auction, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable weight of being trusted. She paid the county its $840 on a bright, cold morning in November, and the clerk, a nervous young man named Purdy, asked her 3 times if she was certain, and stamped the deed at last with the air of a man humoring the mad. And so Marguerite Vasey, who 2 weeks before had owned the finest bottomland south of the Bend, walked out into the thin winter sun, the owner of 40 acres of dying trees that the whole town agreed were worthless, with $1 in her pocket and a divining rod under her arm. And she went straight away up the north slope to begin. The first days on the slope were a lesson in exactly how alone a person could be. She built herself a shelter against the old stone wall Bertrand Osier had left, half a wall really, mortared with a skill that surprised her, and she gathered deadfall for a fire, and she ate what Audley could spare, and she walked the orchard row by row in the brittle cold, laying her hand on each gray trunk the way a doctor lays a hand on a patient given up for lost. And they were not, she found, entirely dead. Beneath the flaking bark, deep in, there was a thread of green still, a stubbornness of life persisting in trees that should by every reckoning have surrendered decades ago. Something was keeping them alive. Not enough to make them thrive, but enough to refuse to die. And a tree, Marguerite knew as well as she knew anything, does not refuse to die without water somewhere within reach of its roots. She took up the divining rod on the 3rd morning, the witch hazel fork her father had cut before she was born, worn smooth by 3 generations of hands, and she walked the slope slowly, holding it loose the way he had taught her, letting the land speak. For a long while it said nothing, and then near the center of the orchard, where the oldest and largest walnut stood, a great gnarled sentinel that Osier must have planted. First of all, the rod dipped so hard and so sudden that it nearly leapt from her grip, bowing toward the earth with a force she had felt only a handful of times in 50 years of reading water. She stood very still. Then she knelt and pressed her palm flat to the pale, cracked ground, and she felt it again, unmistakable now. The coolness, the faint breath of damp rising from below like the exhalation of something sleeping. She began to dig at the base of the great walnut with a spade. Amos Reyes had lent her, and it was slow, cruel work for a woman of 53 in the frozen ground, and she made little progress that first day or the second. But on the 3rd day of digging, some 4 feet down among the thick old roots, her spade struck something that was not stone and not root-a-flat. Worked surface, wood gone black and hard as iron with age, banded with iron straps, rusted to lace. It was a lid. A door set into the earth, framed in dressed stone, and across its face, carved deep and still legible under the grime of 40 years, were words in a language she did not at first understand, until she cleared them with her sleeve and read the French her husband had taught her a little of. Ici dort l'eau, qu'elle serve tous, here sleeps the water, may it serve all. She sat back on her heels in the cold hole among the roots, and she did not move for a long time, because she understood in that moment that Bertrand Osier had not planted an orchard at all. He had planted a marker. The walnuts, slow and bitter and refusing to die, had been set there not for their fruit, but for their roots, the deep, questing, thirsty roots of the black walnut, which drive down further than almost any tree of the plains, sent down like living ropes to find and hold and hide the thing beneath. The whole cursed folly of the North Slope had been, from the first, an elaborate and patient concealment, and what it concealed lay under the door beneath her hands. It took her 4 more days to clear the door and to understand its cunning. It was not merely buried, it was sealed, mortared into a stone frame, and the mortar itself was of a kind she had never seen, a pale, hard cement that had resisted 40 years of frost. She could not force it alone, and she would not have wanted to, for as she worked, she began to grasp what she had found and to fear what its finding might unleash. For beneath that door, she was now certain, was not a cellar and not a grave, but a spring, an underground spring, contained and channeled and hidden by a man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret, in a valley where water was the difference between life and abandonment, between a town that lived and a town that dried up and blew away. She found the rest of the story in the wall. On the eighth day, sheltering from a squall against Osia's half-built stone wall, she noticed that one of the stones sat a hair proud of its fellows, and when she worked it free with her knife, she found behind it a hollow, and in the hollow a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, and in the box a bundle of papers, in a fine, cramped hand the journal and the last testament of Bertrand Osier himself. She read them by firelight over the next several nights, translating slowly, her husband's ghost seeming to lean over her shoulder, and the whole strange truth of the North Slope opened before her like a flower blooming in reverse, back toward its root. Osier had been a hydraulic engineer, trained in France, who had come west in the 1850s, chasing the same dream as every other man. But where they chased gold, he chased water, which he rightly judged the more precious in that country. In the summer of his first year, he had discovered, by the same reading of the land that Marguerite's father practiced by instinct and he by science, a great artesian spring welling up beneath the North Slope, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks through channels miles long and ages old, a spring of such volume that, properly opened and directed, it could have watered the entire valley in perpetuity, turned the whole dry basin green, made Harrow's Bend a garden. He had wept, he wrote, when he found it. And then he had done a thing that Marguerite read 3 times before she believed it. He had buried it. For Osier had come to the valley in a bitter season. The land around the spring had belonged then to a syndicate of speculators out of Denver, ruthless men who he had seen with his own eyes, dammed and hoarded water upstream to drive out small farmers and buy their ruined land for pennies. Osier understood that if these men learned of the spring, they would seize it, meter it, sell it, drop by drop, and lord it over every soul in the valley for 100 years. Water that could have served all would serve only the greedy, and so he made a terrible, patient choice. He sealed the spring with his own hands and his own science, capping it beneath a stone chamber and a mortared door, and over it he planted 40 acres of black walnut, whose roots would guard and hide it, and he let the town believe him a failure and a fool. And he wrote in his journal that he would keep the water sleeping until a day came when it might be given to the people themselves and not to any man who would sell it. He waited 3 years for that day, and it did not come, and his health failed. In one winter he left, meaning to return with allies and never managing it, and he died. Marguerite would later learn of a lung fever in a Cheyenne boarding house in 1863, his secret intact, his door unopened, his walnuts left to guard an empty valley's forgotten salvation for 40 years, until a ruined widow with a witch hazel rod knelt in the frost and felt the ground breathe. At the bottom of the tin box was one more paper, and it was the one that mattered most, for it was the deed and water claim that Osier had filed and paid for and hidden a legal claim to the spring and its waters, dated and witnessed and never recorded because he had died before he could risk it, but valid, she believed, still as the founding claim senior to every water right in the valley, including the damned and hoarded rights that had passed down the years to the man who now ruled Harrow's Bend's thirst. For the Denver syndicate's holdings had been bought up decades on by a single ambitious local man who had made himself the master of the valley's water and grown rich metering it out to desperate farmers in the dry years, and that man was Elias Crandall. Marguerite understood then that she held in her cracked hands not merely her own salvation, but the whole town's, and that the man standing between the town and its life was the same man who had cast her out. And she understood, too, that Elias Crandall would stop at nothing to keep the North Slope's secret buried, because a free and public spring, senior to his own hoarded rights, would end his kingdom in a single season. She had thought herself finished with him. She saw now that they were only beginning. Word travels in a small valley the way water travels underground unseen, until it surfaces. Marguerite had told only Amos Reyes and Ottilie Fisk of the door, swearing them to silence, but she had needed a stonemason to help her understand the chamber, and she had needed the county records to confirm Ozier's claim, and young Purdy, the clerk, however nervous, could not keep a secret from his own employer, for the county's water business ran through Elias Crandall's bank. Within a fortnight, Elias knew that the widow he had ruined was digging at the base of the Great Walnut on Ozier's Folly, and that she had been asking questions about old water claims, and this troubled his sleep as nothing had in years. He came up the north slope himself in a fine buggy with 2 hired men riding behind on a cold, clear day in December, and he found Marguerite at the mouth of the pit, mud to her elbows, the great iron-banded door now fully exposed at the bottom. He did not smile this time. He looked down into the hole for a long moment, and she watched his face as he read the French carved in the wood, for Elias was an educated man and understood exactly what times ici dort lo times meant, and she saw the color leave him. Then he recovered himself and offered her, in that reasonable banker's tone, a great deal of money, $2,000. He said, more than triple what she had paid for the worthless slope, out of pure Christian charity toward a struggling widow. When she declined, the number climbed to 5,000, and then his voice roughening to 10. And when she declined again, he stopped pretending and told her flatly that she was trespassing on matters far beyond her, that the water beneath that door was already his by right and by claim, and that if she opened it, she would open nothing but her own ruin, for he would tie her in courts until her borrowed dollars and her borrowed years ran out together. Marguerite climbed out of the pit and stood before him in the cold, a woman half his weight and twice his age, filthy and unbowed, and she told him what she had found in the wall. She told him of Ozier's journal and Ozier's claim, dated and witnessed and senior to every right he held, and she watched the threat drain out of his face and something colder pour in to replace it. He knew water law as a preacher knows scripture, and he knew that a senior claim, if it stood, would unmake him. He looked at the door and at the papers she was careful to say she had not brought with her, and at the 2 hired men behind him, and for one long moment Marguerite understood that she stood at the edge of real danger, alone on a hillside, with a desperate man who had already taken everything from her once. But Elias Crandall was a coward at his root, as such men usually are, and he did his violence through paper and law where it left no stain on his hands. He did not touch her. He climbed back into his buggy and told her, evenly, that the claim she spoke of had never been recorded and therefore did not exist, that possession was the whole of the law in this dry country, and that he would see her enjoined from disturbing his water and her fool's orchard sold out from under her for the debts she'd taken on to buy it. Then he drove away down the slope, and Marguerite stood a long while in the failing light, and she was afraid, and she prayed, and then she did what her father's daughter would do. She got to work, because a right unclaimed is a right lost, and she meant to record Ozier's claim before Elias could bury it a second time. The next weeks were a quiet war fought in the courthouse at Harrow's Bend and the district land office at Fort Collins, and Marguerite fought it with the only weapons she had, the truth, the papers, and the trust of a valley. Elias moved first, as men with money do, securing an injunction from a judge who banked at his bank, forbidding her to break the seal of the door. But Marguerite had spent 20 years earning things that could not be bought, and now she spent them. Amos Reyes rode 2 days to Fort Collins with Ozier's papers sewn into his coat and laid them before a land commissioner who owed Elias nothing. Ottilie Fisk gathered the sworn statements of a dozen old-timers who remembered the Frenchman in his stone wall. And Marguerite herself wrote out, in the neat, clear hand she had once used to keep her husband's accounts, the whole history of the spring and the claim. And she made copies, and she put them into the hands of a newspaper man in Fort Collins who had made his small reputation exposing exactly the kind of water baron Elias Crandall had become. The claim held. It held because it was true, and because it was old, and because Bertrand Ozier, whatever else he had been, had filed it properly 40 years before and paid his fee, so that the record existed in the deep files of the land office, even though it had never been brought to bear. Ozier's water right predated the Denver syndicates, and therefore predated everything Elias had bought from the syndicate's heirs. And here was the thing that broke Elias's back. Osier had not filed the claim in his own name for his own profit. He had filed it in the careful, French-inflected legal language of the day, as a claim held in trust for the public benefit of the inhabitants of the valley, a dedication, the commissioner called it, of the water to the common good. It could not be bought because it had never been for sale. It belonged and had always belonged to the people of Harrow's Bend. And the executor of a lapsed public trust, the commissioner ruled, could reasonably be the present owner of the land under which it lay, which was to say, the woman who had paid $840 for a dying orchard, Marguerite Vasey. They opened the door on a morning in early spring, with half the town gathered on the north slope in the thin gold light. Amos Reyes and 3 other men broke the ancient mortar with cold chisels, working slow so as not to shatter Ozier's chamber, and when at last they raised the iron-banded door on its rusted hinges, there came up out of the dark a sound like a great slow breath, and then the smell of deep, cold, clean water, and then the water itself, welling up sweet and steady and endless, as it had welled unseen for 40 years, and for 10,000 years before that, patient beneath the guarding roots. It filled the stone chamber and ran out along the channel Osier had cut for it and had waited, and it went down the slope in a bright ribbon toward the dry town, and the people stood and watched it come, and many of them wept, hard-handed, farmers and their wives and their children, because they had lived their whole lives thirsty on top of an ocean and had never known. Marguerite could have sold that water. She held by the commissioner's ruling the practical keeping of it, and Elias's $10,000 had been only his first offer. There were syndicates and railroads that would have made her rich beyond her father's wildest reading of the land. She did not. She had read Ogier's testament by firelight. Kill served 2 times, may it serve all, and she understood the whole point of the man's long, lonely deception, which was that he had refused to let water be a weapon, and she would not undo his life's meaning for her comfort. Instead, she called the valley together in Ottilie Fisk's boarding house, and she gave the spring back to them the way Osier had intended, as a trust held in common, governed by the farmers themselves, its waters shared out by need and not by coin, forever. She kept the orchard, and she kept enough for herself to live, and she paid back every borrowed dollar within 2 years from the sale of the walnuts, which watered at last from below by the freed spring and pruned by her husband's grafting knives, and her patient hands burst into a bearing they had never known, throwing sweet nuts by the bushel as though 40 years of thirst had been storing up their gratitude. As for Elias Crandall, his ruin required no cruelty from her hand, which was the only justice she wanted. When the spring was declared a public trust and its senior right confirmed, his own hoarded water rights, built on the dammed and stolen flow upstream, were open to challenge, and the farmers he had bled for a decade brought suit after suit, and the newspaper man in Fort Collins printed the whole history of Osier's folly, and the valley that had once tipped its hat to Elias Crandall now crossed the street to avoid him. His bank, which had thrived on other men's thirst, failed within 3 years when the valley, watered and prosperous and free of him, no longer needed to borrow against the drought. He sold his holdings for a fraction of their worth, including, Marguerite noted, without triumph, the good bottomland south of the bend that had once been Peter's, which she bought back with walnut money and gave freehold to a young family who had lost their own farm to one of Elias's foreclosures. He left Harrow's Bend a poor man and an unmourned one, and the last anyone heard he had gone east to live on the charity of a cousin, which was a fate he had planned for so many others that even the tender-hearted found it hard to grieve. And so we come back to where we began, to a woman of 53 with $84 and a flour sack, cast out by a smiling man onto the courthouse steps, who did the foolish thing, the desperate thing, and paid $840 for 40 acres of dying trees that the whole world had written off. We told you that beneath those brittle roots, something waited that would save her and restore a town, and now you know it was water, the plainest, humblest, most despised and most precious thing in all that dry country, sleeping under a Frenchman's patient love and a widow's stubborn faith, guarded by the deep, thirsty roots of trees too honest to die. Marguerite Vasey did not find a fortune, or rather she found one and gave it away, and in the giving she became something the valley had not had in 40 years. A person who understood that the richest ground is the ugliest, that value does not announce itself, and that the Lord, as her father told her on his knees in the despised dirt, buries his best gifts where lazy men will not stoop to look. She lived out her days on the north slope among the greening walnuts, reading water for any who asked and never taking pay. And the town that had laughed came at last to call the place not Ozier's Folly, but the Vasey Spring, which is what the maps of that valley call it to this very day. Thank you for sitting with us through this one and for staying to the end where the water is. If this story warms some quiet place in you, share it with someone who has been written off, someone standing on their own dry hillside, certain there is nothing left beneath their feet, and tell them what waited under Marguerite's walnuts. And before you go, we would love to hear from you. What is a time in your own life when you found value in something, a place, a person, a chance that everyone else had given up on? Tell us in the comments, for those are the stories we love best. Until next time, dear friend, keep your rod loose, your faith deep, and your ear tuned to the ground beneath you, and stay close.